the people that try to make you scared, you know, and fight back.
I was so appalled by the way I looked.
Get that camera the away from
single Marvel movie released. The big lead up, the excitement, the hype that the mainstream media desperately tries to generate. And it always ends up happening this way.
It's been a dream to join the MCU. The movie is called The Fantastic Four. I'll confess, I did all my stretching for...
And now you got Disney CEO Bob Iger only making matters worse.
Marvel was supposed to be untouchable. For over a decade, the brand alone could carry a film to the billion-dollar mark, no matter who was in the cast or what the story was about. But then came the risk that changed everything. Pedro Pascal, the man hailed as Hollywood's golden boy, the star of The Last of Us and The Mandalorian, was handpicked as the face of Marvel's grand reset. The studio didn't just cast him as Reed Richards, they built an entire empire on his shoulders. The Fantastic Four reboot wasn't marketed as a team story. It wasn't even sold as the beginning of Marvel's next phase. It was sold as Pedro Pascal saves the MCU. His face was plastered across billboards in Times Square. His interviews dominated late-night TV. His quotes were pushed in every entertainment magazine. For months, the message was clear. This wasn't a Marvel movie. This was a Pedro Pascal event. And at first, the risk looked brilliant. Opening weekend headlines screamed about Marvel's comeback. Fans showed up out of sheer curiosity, hoping to see their favorite actor redefine one of Marvel's most iconic roles. For a brief moment, it seemed like Marvel had finally rediscovered its magic, but that illusion didn't last. Within days, cracks began to show. Critics were cautious, audiences divided, and whispers of doubt started spreading online.
Disney and Marvel Studios, they went into panic mode, they went into damage control mode, over, of course, all the Hollywood trades talking about this.
And then, almost overnight, the story flipped. Marvel's savior became its liability. The movie that was supposed to reset the MCU instead exposed just how fragile the empire really was. So the question now isn't just whether Marvel made a mistake, the question is bigger. Has the superhero era itself finally collapsed? And if so, will Pedro Pascal forever be remembered as the man who accidentally brought it down? The risk began long before cameras started rolling. Behind the scenes, Marvel was desperate. The last few years had been savage. Films like Eternals and Ant-Man, Quantumania proved that the once invincible MCU was no longer bulletproof. Audiences were tired, critics were harsher than ever, and box office numbers were sliding downhill.
Used to sell tickets in and of itself. It almost didn't matter what the movie was. People were interested because they were so bought into the MCU. And in particular, late into phase 3, it was just people trusted.
The studio needed a win, a reset button. Enter Fantastic Four. Marvel pitched it not just as another superhero reboot, but as the film that would restore everything. This wasn't just about introducing Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Johnny, and Ben Grimm. It was about proving Marvel could still dominate culture the way it did during Infinity War and Endgame. To make that happen, they needed more than good writing or flashy CGI. They needed a symbol. Pedro Pascal became that symbol. He wasn't just an actor. He was Hollywood's internet daddy, the charismatic star who could charm late-night audiences as easily as he could headline massive franchises. Disney executives latched onto his name like it was their lifeline. Casting him as Reed Richards wasn't just about fitting a character, it was about selling hope, and they went all in. Marketing budgets leaned heavily on Pascal's image. Trailers framed him as the centerpiece. Posters downplayed the rest of the Fantastic Four. The unspoken message was clear. This isn't about the team. This is about Pedro Pascal bringing Marvel back to life. It was a bold move, but it was also reckless. Because when you stack an entire franchise on the shoulders of one actor, there's no safety net. If the risk pays off, you've got a superstar leading you into a new golden age. But if it won't, then your golden boy becomes the face of your downfall. Marvel knew the stakes, but they moved forward anyway. And for one short weekend, it looked like the risk had worked. Opening weekend told a story Marvel executives were desperate to hear. With a flashy debut of over $17 million, the headlines practically wrote themselves. Marvel is back. Pedro Pascal delivers. Fantastic Four launches a new era. On the surface, it felt like a comeback. Fans flooded theaters opening night, curious to see what Pascal would bring to the role of Reed Richards. The hype was strong enough to drown out early skepticism. On social media, Marvel stans posted selfies at theaters. Critics cautiously praised the energy of the reboot, and analysts projected that the film was on track for a healthy global run. For a brief moment, it seemed like the magic had returned, but if you looked closely, the cracks were already showing. Critics weren't calling the movie groundbreaking. Their praise was laced with hesitation. Phrases like better than expected or a solid start. Not exactly the triumphant language Marvel was hoping for. Fans too were divided. Some loved Pascal's quirky take on Reed Richards, while others whispered that something about his performance felt off, awkward, even out of place. Still, Marvel didn't care. To them, the numbers were all that mattered. 17 million in one weekend was proof enough that their risk had paid off, or so they thought, because then came week 2, and everything fell apart. The drop was savage, a catastrophic 66% collapse at the box office. Audiences who showed up out of curiosity didn't return for a second watch. Word of mouth turned bad. Suddenly, the very same critics who had cautiously praised the movie were sharpening their knives. Social media flipped overnight. Instead of "Marvel is back," the headlines now screamed, "Marvel has lost the recipe." And at the center of the storm, Pedro Pascal, the man who was supposed to carry the MCU into its next era, was now being blamed for dragging it down. If opening weekend was a victory lap, the second weekend was a funeral procession. The numbers didn't just dip, they nosedived. A 66% crash at the box office made it one of the steepest drops in Marvel history. What was supposed to be Marvel's billion-dollar comeback instantly became the cautionary tale no one could ignore. Fans who had been curious enough to buy a ticket once refused to come back for a second viewing. Instead, the conversation online shifted from cautious optimism to outright roasting. Memes spread like wildfire. Side-by-side edits of Pedro Pascal looking lost compared to past versions of Reed Richards, TikToks with captions like "Marvel really cast the wrong guy," and Twitter threads that shredded the movie's dialogue and tone. Critics, sensing something in the water, doubled down. Early praise that called the movie energetic was replaced with savage takedowns. Headlines compared it not just to Eternals, but worse, to Green Lantern, the infamous box office disaster that nearly ended Ryan Reynolds' superhero career. Industry analysts labeled it a textbook implosion, the kind of flop that reshapes entire strategies in Hollywood. And through it all, one name kept popping up: Pedro Pascal, the actor who once couldn't miss, a man who had headlined The Last of Us, The Mandalorian, and even Game of Thrones, was now painted as the weakling. Social media users said his Reed Richards felt like a parody, awkward and cartoonish, rather than the stoic genius Marvel fans had been waiting for. Others accused Disney of leaning on his star power instead of building a strong story or ensemble cast. It wasn't just about the numbers anymore, it was about optics. Marvel's golden boy had become the face of Marvel's biggest miscalculation. The studio had rolled the dice, and the dice came up snake eyes. By the end of the second weekend, the once bright narrative of "Marvel is back" was gone, replaced with a harsher, more dangerous question. Has Marvel finally lost the formula? And if so, can they ever get it back? The collapse triggered a ripple effect inside Marvel that went far beyond box office projections. In the past, Marvel could spin a weak release into something positive. They could lean on future cameos, tease upcoming Avengers connections, or drown negative press under a wave of new announcements at Comic-Con. But this time, they didn't even try. Instead, Marvel went silent, calculated, suffocating silence. There were no triumphant press releases celebrating milestones, no early streaming drop on Disney Plus to reignite conversation, not even a token marketing push to remind fans about the rest of the cast. Marvel's strategy was simple: bury the body and pretend it never happened. But silence isn't neutral, it speaks volumes. Fans noticed immediately. On Reddit and Twitter, posts exploded. Why isn't Marvel talking about this movie? Are they embarrassed? Is Pedro Pascal already being pushed out? The lack of transparency fueled speculation that things behind the scenes were far worse than anyone imagined. And it wasn't just fans talking. Industry insiders began leaking whispers of panic inside Disney. Executives reportedly worried that releasing the film on streaming too soon would only magnify the backlash, dragging the flop back into headlines just as they needed hype to build for Spider-Man, Brand New Day, and eventually Avengers Doomsday.
Fantastic Four First Steps box office situation is throwing both Disney and Marvel Studios into a state of panic for obvious reasons. We know that those out there like Pedro Pascal, who continues to make things political during the press tour of this film, it's not helping at all in any case. And one thing is for certain right now is that the numbers that they're pulling in right now for the box office metrics, these aren't the numbers that they were hoping for, especially before Spider-Man Brand New Day and Avengers Doomsday in, of course, 2026.
One trade publication even quoted an anonymous studio insider admitting, "The movie is radioactive. We can't touch it." That silence also carried another consequence. It left room for Marvel's rivals to control the narrative. DC seized the opportunity, reframing its own struggles as minor compared to Marvel's implosion. Netflix stepped into the spotlight with a cultural juggernaut that made Fantastic Four look irrelevant. And for the first time in over a decade, Marvel wasn't leading the conversation. They were hiding from it. The optics were devastating. Marvel used to be the studio that defined global culture, the one that dictated the terms of the blockbuster industry. Now, they looked fragile, uncertain, and afraid. And through every headline, one name remained attached to the failure: Pedro Pascal. The man who was supposed to save the MCU was now the actor who symbolized its most insulting defeat. Marvel thought silence would protect them. Instead, it made them look weaker than ever. While Marvel was drowning in silence, DC saw an opening, and they moved fast. James Gunn, the new creative lead at DC, made a decision that stunned Hollywood. Superman was pulled from theaters far earlier earlier than anyone expected. Officially, the studio framed it as a strategic release window, claiming they wanted to line it up with the next season of Peacemaker on streaming, but no one was buying that explanation. The truth was in the numbers. Superman had scraped together around $586 million worldwide. On paper, that sounded fine, but for a film with a break-even point rumored to be over $700 million, it was clear the movie hadn't met expectations. Instead of letting the headlines drag out over weeks about how Superman was underperforming, Gunn and Warner Brothers made the bold play. Cut it short, shift to digital, and spin the narrative before it turned into Backlash. And it worked, at least in the short term. Industry headlines framed DC's move as strategic instead of desperate. Social media compared Marvel's silence with DC's decisive pivot. Suddenly, the conversation shifted. Marvel was hiding. DC was adapting. That contrast was everything. It didn't matter that both studios were struggling to reignite their fan bases. Optics are king in Hollywood, and compared to Marvel's insult, DC looked like the smarter, more agile studio. Fans noticed too. On Twitter and TikTok, people started saying things like, "At least DC admits when they're in trouble," or "Marvel can't even own up to their mistakes." The internet turned DC's move into a subtle victory. Not because Superman was a hit, but because Marvel looked worse by comparison. For the first time in years, DC wasn't the studio being laughed at. Marvel was, and that shift in perception was seismic. But just as the Marvel versus DC rivalry was heating up, an unexpected player stormed onto the scene. A challenger no one had predicted, one that didn't even come from the superhero genre. Out of nowhere, Netflix delivered the knockout blow that neither Marvel nor DC saw coming. It wasn't a cape and cowl blockbuster. It wasn't even a live-action film. It was an animated musical, K-pop Demon Hunters. What started as a quirky Netflix original exploded into a full-blown cultural event. For 8 straight weeks, it dominated streaming charts worldwide. Unlike Disney hits like Frozen or Encanto, which saw huge spikes followed by steep declines, K-pop Demon Hunters didn't just hold steady. It kept climbing. The secret was rewatch value. Fans weren't just watching it once. They were looping it over and over, fueling an online frenzy that spread across TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter. Then came the move that changed everything. Netflix announced a limited theatrical sing-along release. Within hours, advance tickets sold out in city after city. Theaters scrambled to add more screenings. Suddenly, the little animated film was stealing screen space away from both Marvel and DC, and it didn't stop there. The movie's soundtrack detonated on the global charts. Its lead single, Golden, soared to the top of the Billboard Global 200, racking up streams that dwarfed anything Marvel or DC had tied to their films. Suddenly, kids, teens, and even adults weren't talking about superheroes. They were talking about animated demon hunting idols and singing along in theaters packed with energy Marvel could only dream of. The cultural contrast was savage. On one side, Marvel was hiding from its biggest flop in years. On the other, DC was scrambling to spin a loss into a minor victory. And meanwhile, Netflix, a studio not even known for theatrical blockbusters, was capturing the cultural moment with an animated juggernaut. The message was clear. The superhero genre was no longer guaranteed to dominate the box office. For the first time in over a decade, the biggest conversation in global entertainment wasn't about Marvel or DC. It was about something entirely different. And for Marvel, the timing couldn't have been worse. While Pedro Pascal's Fantastic Four was being dragged online, K-pop Demon Hunters was being celebrated as the new face of pop culture. A billion-dollar franchise had just been overshadowed by a streaming service's animated risk. The superhero monopoly on cultural relevance was gone, and Pedro Pascal, once branded Marvel's savior, was now left standing in the shadow of singing cartoon idols. For years, Pedro Pascal was untouchable. He wasn't just another actor. He was the actor. The face of the Mandalorian, the reluctant protector in The Last of Us, the fan favorite Oberyn Martell in Game of Thrones. Every role he touched seemed to turn into cultural gold. The internet adored him. Memes crowned him as Hollywood's daddy. His interviews trended even when he wasn't promoting a project. He was the rare star who felt both larger than life and relatable. But Marvel changed that almost overnight. When Fantastic Four: First Steps collapsed, it wasn't Marvel as a studio that got most of the blame. It wasn't even the writing or directing team. It was Pascal. He became the lightning rod for all the criticism. On social media, his name trended alongside the word flop. Fans roasted his performance as awkward, calling his Reed Richards less of a genius leader and more of a late-night comedy sketch. Others argued he was miscast from the very beginning, that Marvel had chosen him not because he fit the role, but because his name was hot at the time. Memes poured in, edits of Pascal sleepwalking through scenes, side-by-sides comparing him to earlier versions of Reed Richards, and jokes that Marvel had cast internet daddy instead of a serious scientist. The internet had turned the beloved star into a punchline. Behind the scenes, the whispers grew darker. Industry insiders leaked that Marvel executives were already second-guessing their decision to lean so heavily on him in marketing. Some questioned if his star power had been overestimated. After all, his biggest hits were ensemble projects, backed by strong writing and world-building. Without those safety nets, he suddenly looked vulnerable. And that's the cruel cycle of Hollywood. One moment you're untouchable. The next, you're branded as the actor who sank a billion-dollar franchise. For Pascal, the damage was personal. What was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the role that defined his career, was instead the one that might haunt him for years. Instead of being remembered as the man who who saved Marvel, he risked being remembered as the man who exposed its collapse. And as his reputation cracked, the conversation shifted again, away from Pascal himself and toward an even bigger question. Was this the moment the superhero era itself finally came crashing down? The truth is, Fantastic Four wasn't just a flop, it was a symptom of something bigger. For over a decade, superheroes dominated global culture. Marvel films were more than movies. They were events. Fans didn't just buy tickets, they cleared their schedules months in advance. People didn't ask if you were going to see the new Marvel release, they asked when. But that magic is gone. Audiences today aren't lining up out of loyalty. They're pickier, more skeptical, and more fatigued. They've seen the multiverse. They've seen the world-ending stakes. They've seen heroes rise and fall a dozen times. And the formula, once revolutionary, now feels recycled. Marvel's risk on Pascal was supposed to reignite that fire. Instead, it highlighted the very problem they were trying to cover up. You can't market your way out of audience exhaustion. You can't plaster a famous face on posters and expect fans to blindly trust the brand anymore. Meanwhile, rivals are adapting. DC is spinning losses into manageable setbacks. Netflix is rewriting the cultural playbook with unexpected hits like K-pop Demon Hunters. Even non-superhero films, horror, musicals, biopics are carving out cultural moments that feel fresher, more urgent, and more exciting than another CGI-heavy blockbuster. For Marvel, the stakes couldn't be higher. Their last hope lies in Spider-Man, Brand New Day, and eventually Avengers Doomsday. But here's the danger. If audiences walk into those films with skepticism, or worse, apathy, the damage could be irreversible. Event films live on momentum, and right now, Marvel has none. That's the chilling reality. The empire that once seemed untouchable now feels fragile. The studio that once defined culture now looks like it's chasing it. And Pedro Pascal, the actor who was supposed to be Marvel's savior, may forever be tied to the moment when audiences stopped believing in superheroes. So maybe the real question isn't whether Fantastic Four failed. Maybe the real question is whether this flop marked the beginning of the end of the superhero golden age. And when history looks back, will Pedro Pascal be remembered as the actor who saved Marvel or as the man who accidentally signaled its collapse?